Hello and welcome to another episode of Fire 5 at Phoenix. So if you've not joined us for any of these episodes before, the concept is really simple. We have a topic, we have a guest, and we have 5 questions. So the guests will introduce themselves shortly. The topic that we are talking about today is change, and Han, my guest today, has got 5 questions. I haven't seen the questions, so I have no idea what is coming. What I do know is that Han is incredibly experienced in their field of sports psychology and has lots of information that I'm sure is going to be really helpful. I know it's going to be a really interesting conversation. I just don't know how that conversation is going to go. So I am looking forward to this. We've had this booked in for a little while, haven't we? It's been a long time coming, so I'm really happy to get the conversation started. But before we get into the questions, Han, do you want to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Han Newman. As you said, I work in sport and exercise psychology. So there's kind of 2 sides to that. One side is I work in academia, in universities with teaching and research. And then on the other side, alongside that, I run Newman Sports Psychology, which is my applied sports psychology business. So working with people on a one-to-one basis, whether that's on their mindset in relation to competitive sport, or whether it's helping someone build a better relationship with physical activity and exercise, perhaps someone who's looking to increase their physical activity, for example. And as part of that work, I also do workshops with gyms to members and stuff like that. So work in universities and then work applied in an applied sense with one-to-one clients and delivering workshops.
Amazing. And are you noticing that there's more people taking up the sports psychology side of this? Because I'm thinking back to, you know, when I competed and when we first met, sports psychology quite then was for the elites, like for your professional athletes. But I'm noticing a lot more, you know, people generally are noticing that mindset has a massive impact, whether you're a professional or you do it as a hobby. So have you noticed the difference over the years of it changing?
Yeah, I really have. I think, you know, from when I first started studying sports psychology, sort of well over 10 years ago now, probably, which makes me feel really old. It was still felt very small then, that when you mentioned it to people didn't really know what you were talking about. There was something reserved for those competing at the highest levels. And I guess traditionally sports psychology was focused on how can I be at my absolute best and how can my mindset contribute to that. Now I think we see it a lot as a lot broader than that. That's still a key part of it for those competing at that level, but that there's also a lot to do with well-being, whether it's as a competitive athlete or as a non-athlete, as a general population member, and also just seeing how those sort of health and performance things can sort of come together and conflict a lot of the time. I think, you know, in the world that we come from, strongman, strongwoman, where we met, there's a lot of people who get into that as a health-based journey, but it becomes something performance-based because they start competing, they get caught up in the hype, start moving up the performance ladder, and then those sort of performance behaviours are conflicting with the health goals they had initially, and there's sort of a journey to understanding what someone's place is in the sport, how the performance interacts with health, what's right for them within that. So I think that forms a large part of the work that I do with people at the moment. I work with a lot of people who have been involved in strength training or strength sports, and that sort of health versus performance mindset and the behaviors that go alongside that, and sort of trying to figure out, okay, why am I doing this? And, you know, is this performance side that's creeping in, is that right for me? Is that really what I want from it? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But that sort of those tensions, sort of a lot of the work that I do is sort of exploring what those tensions are and how to work beyond them, I think.
Yeah, that definitely resonates with me. And definitely that mirrors where I was, you know, with my journey with that too. So I am very aware that I sneaked in a question to you before we even got started. So I think it's a really interesting topic, and I mean it's all part of the change, isn't it? You even just in that bit there, and we haven't even got to the 5 questions yet, but we're already talking about that change, the change of focus, change of priorities, that change of dynamic is, change really is everywhere. But let me shut up and let let you ask the questions that you came on here to ask. And God, Zoe, take over. Right, let me zip and listen, and you go with the first question.
Okay, so the question I wanted to kick off with was, how would you define successful change in the context of your work?
Ooh. I mean, I guess really it depends to the individual that I'm working with, and actually that's really important for me, not to assume what success looks like for that individual and really get that clarity on it. And I had a first session with a new client today, and we spent pretty much a lot of that first session talking about where are they now, where is it they want to get to, and how do they want to get there? What's the way they want to get there in a way that works for them? Because it is very much determined by them, and success looks very different to different people, and that can change as well. So it's really important for me to keep that in mind, that if I feel there's been a slight shift to some of our early conversations, to check in with people to see whether or not things have changed, because sometimes as we progress on that journey, like we've just been talking about, priorities change, or the focus changes, or people change their minds, and that's okay. And it's okay to re-examine what success looks like to you and change the goalposts, because ultimately our life, our goals, right? And so it's okay for us to change the goalposts of where we're heading or what success looks like. So it is very much determined by them. I think from my personal view, like as the coach, it's a real challenge, because as a coach, I'm totally bought into them getting where they want to get to, but it's also not in my control. And it's not, it's that walking or going alongside them, but it's their journey. And so their decisions, their speed, their direction, it's not in my control. And, coaching is very much me being their thinking partner. But, I talk to people about, they are still in the driving seat. And so until they're ready to get in the car and start the engine and determine where it is they want to get to and how they want to get to, I can stay sitting in the passenger seat for as long as that takes. So I'm not in control, and sometimes I can't influence the outcome of their success either. So that definitely took a little while to get used to, starting off on this. And, this is coming up to year 6. It's taken a little while. And sometimes, we're invested in their success. Absolutely. And I always take time to reflect on what I felt was successful in someone's coaching journey. What, how did I show up as a coach? What might I do differently next time? What have I learned from that coaching experience? Because every coaching experience is very different. So I'm always looking for the learning, and I'm looking for the successes in that of, where have I learned? Where have I grown? Where have I done something different that has worked really well? To take successes and the learning for me. But yes, ultimately it's not about me, it's about them and their journey. So I guess that's what my answer would be. I mean, is it similar for you with your in your coaching world?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the very first point you made around it being about the individual is sort of very key to my work as well. And I think that can be quite not unusual. I'm trying to think of the right word, but I guess I'm thinking about sort of the fitness and exercise industries that a lot of my work is sort of seated in, the spaces that and sort of the tendency in the past. I think things are changing, but that when people think of making change in relation to fitness, exercise, health, that there's sort of often numerical data attached to that, or physical attributes that might have changed, fitness levels, etc. And that, if the tendency for, I think that's something that I have to sort of work through with people a lot in the work that I do is okay, that could be a measure of change, but is that the right measure for you? That's a measure of change, depending on your goals, where you're going with things, what's important to you. That that could be a relevant marker of change, but is it the right one for you? And I guess the other thing I was thinking about as you were talking is sort of the short term versus the long term, I think, is what comes up for me a lot in the work that I do and in the spaces that I work in, of sort of, okay, well, short term behavior change in terms of perhaps exercising more, training more, the consequences of that, whether it's changes to fitness levels, changes to body composition, etc., versus long term sustainable change, I guess. And so I think there's a tendency at the moment for, in my mind, successful change to look like something more sustainable in the longer term, as opposed to right over those 12 weeks, X, Y, Z has changed. But at the same time, that long-term sustainable change in some kind of behavior might not be what someone else determines as successful change for them either. So I think, sort of, I think I'm at a point now where I'm sort of trying to mesh those thoughts of, my perception of, in the exercise psychology space, what is a healthier change, a more successful change in that sense, but actually is, weighing that up alongside, well, actually the person that sat in front of me, is that the right change for them still? I think that's, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally does. I mean, I think as a coach, it's really difficult as well, isn't it? Because obviously we're we have to put our own thoughts and ideologies and our own experiences to one side. And I think for me, I guess, picking up on what you've just said there, I guess one of the measures of success for me in terms of from the coaching perspective is, can this person now go away and continue their journey on their own? Like, have they now got the tools and the resources and that mindset to be able to go and continue that, whatever that looks like? And I think that's quite often a measure of success for me. And I've had messages maybe like a year after I've worked with somebody, and somebody will just be a random Instagram DM or Facebook message that just simply says, this happened to me this week, and I sat there and thought, what would Zoe ask me in this situation? And I've coached myself through it, and this is the outcome. And that for me is like, that's it. They've got the confidence, they've got that mindset, because coaching isn't forever. We can't be on that, we're not meant to be on that journey with people forever. And it might be that, there's additional things that we can help them to learn, help them to understand, but ultimately it's them finding their own resources to be able to continue. And I think that's probably one of the key measures of success from the coaching perspective is, have they now got the tools and resources and the confidence to continue, without needing sessions with me to work things through. So,
absolutely.
Yeah, it's a really good point.
Yeah, and I think that links into sort of how I see that word of sustainability at this point. So I think, sustainability is a big thing in the fitness space. We know that lots of people make changes to their fitness behavior. It's short-lived. Something changes again, perhaps reverts back to what it was. So there is a drive to sort of help people to make more long-term sustainable change. But actually, for me, that sustainability isn't necessarily about them still doing that behavior that they've chosen to do, whether it's a particular type of exercise or whatever it is. The sustainability to me isn't necessarily about them still doing that a year down the line after the coaching process, but it's being sustainable in, sort of consistently and over time still being able to make the right decisions for themselves on what's right for them at that moment in time, whether it's in line with their values, priorities, etc. And actually it's that process that someone goes through that needs to be there in the longer term for me than it is about the actual behavior. It's a year down the line, are they still making decisions based on around their health and fitness behavior that are based on their values, their priorities in life, what's right for them, or have they slipped back into, well, being influenced by other things and picking up things that aren't right for them. So that's the bit that needs to be sustainable for me. And to me, that's
so true.
That's successful. If someone's getting back in contact with me and saying, you know what, I was having these thoughts, or this came up, and I was able to work it through and come to the conclusion that this, that was the right solution for me in that moment. That wasn't, because it didn't align with my priorities. Then I'm like, great. That's the sustainable change I think that I would see as successful.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, absolutely. Nice. Good first question. It's always better once that first question is out the way, like, okay.
Yeah.
Now we're just
yeah. Okay, so moving on to the next one, I was wanting to sort of think about barriers to change. What are some of the most common barriers to change that you've come across in your work?
I would say it's the beliefs. It's that belief system that people have, whatever that is, that tends to be the biggest blocker. So I quite often will talk people through that. It's the beliefs that drive the behavior, that drive the response. And this has come up in other episodes of this, so I know I'm repeating myself, but actually it's really important information from my perspective. It's really important information to repeat. We spend, or there's definitely that tendency to spend a lot of time on trying to use willpower and trying to change the behavior or the emotion or that response. But until we spend time looking at the belief that drives that, it's very, very hard. And I think often we need to work at two together. So it does need willpower. It does need a very conscious behavior change of, no, I don't want to do that anymore. I want to do this instead. It does need that. But we also need to work on the belief, the rules in our head, the story that we tell ourselves that drives why we respond in that way. Because if we don't do that, we will only ever be able to change that behavior when we're in that conscious mind and that conscious place in our minds. And as soon as we're tired or hungry or hormonal or emotional or stressed and everything else is taking over, we'll revert back to what we've always done, because that's just what we do. And so we need to change the belief that sits in behind it. And I think that is the biggest blocker, is the belief that we hold, the story that we tell ourselves, the rules that we have, that we apply to things that influence that. And I think what comes up in coaching sessions for me a lot of the time is people haven't always thought about it. It's not an obvious thing to think about. Okay, what is driving that behavior? Why do I do that? And it does quite often go into the past. And sometimes it is an uncomfortable conversation while people are working that through. You don't have to know where it's come from to be able to change it. You just have to know what it is. And you have to know what it is and what do you want it to be. So what is the old belief that is holding you back, and what's the new belief that you want to believe is true that's going to help you to drive those new behaviors? And that comes in with health, that comes in with confidence, patterns of behavior, all of those things, it comes in. But I think that for me is the biggest blocker. But if we can get to that and people can work on that, it's also the biggest driver of change as well. So as often are these things, it's the biggest obstacle in the way, isn't it? And as soon as you remove it, it's what speeds everything up. But it's tough sometimes. It is tough to help support and guide people through that. But it does need the belief change in itself. You have to identify what the belief is. You have to identify what you want to believe is true. And then you have to start consciously looking for all of the things that prove that this new belief is true and reinforcing that. And it is repetition. It's like muscle memory, but in your head is those neurological pathways of this is what I believe, this is the rule, these are my new rules, this is the new story that I tell myself, and this is the new behavior, the new habits, the new responses that I want, that are going to lead me into the life that I'm looking for. So it's a one answer for me. It was a long answer, but it is that one thing I think is beliefs. And it does link into mindset, but I think if you can change the beliefs, so much more changes. It's that kind of ripple effect of, if you change the belief, it has a huge impact across lots of different areas. Whereas if you change the habit, you have to change all of those individual habits that quite often come from the same belief. So
yeah, absolutely. And I think in sort of the realm of my work, people's beliefs around whether their identity as a healthy person or an exerciser or not, and those can be really prevalent and sometimes cause challenges to making change. But also beliefs about what it means to be someone who prioritizes their health or prioritizes fitness, and sort of breaking that back down, like breaking those beliefs down and working on those beliefs, I guess. And I think a lot of that sometimes comes from sort of, I guess, just how those beliefs inform sort of people's perceptions of what it is to be, okay, well, I've decided that I want to make change to my health behavior, to my fitness behavior. I want to be healthier. I want to be fitter. But what that looks like, or their perception of what other people who do that and what that looks like for them, is unachievable to them in their mind. And I think, it's quite a common journey to go through of sort of working out, okay, well, that's, that just because that's that person's way of being healthier, fitter, etc., that doesn't mean that I have to do that. And I think one of the biggest challenges in exercise psychology, from my experiences from people I've worked with, is that all or nothing, sort of that cognitive distortion of all or nothing thinking. If I'm going to do this, then I have to be all in, and then there's sort of that fear of failure that comes in, of like, oh, that feels really difficult for me, that feels really unachievable. It means I'm going to have to let some stuff go that I don't really want to let go of in terms of other areas of my life. So maybe it'd be easier just to not go near that, because try, I'm going to fail, and then I'm going to be back to square one. What was the point?
We've had a conversation in the community group this week around the belief that something is possible. So people that have set goals and just some really real talk. It's very Bristolian, isn't it? Some real talk around just that honesty that people are questioning whether or not the goals that they have set are possible, and that there's a genuine kind of belief in there that it's like, that's not me, I'm dependent on what the goal is. I don't believe that I can be that person who is in this type of healthy body with this type of routine and schedule, that eats this way, that lives this way, that exercises, I think that's the challenge sometimes, isn't it, with the goals that we sometimes set, is that it's great to set those really big and exciting goals, but sometimes it does feel very far away from the current reality, that it's very hard to believe that level of change is possible. But I think also it's attached to our own identity at the moment, and letting go of our existing identity, even when we desperately want to let go of that part of ourselves that is we don't want anymore. It's still part of ourselves, and letting go of that, especially when you hear people describe these behaviors as part of their identity. So I'm an anxious person, or I'm an overeater, or I'm lazy. You hear people attach behaviors to their character, their identity. And so when you get to that position where it's like, okay, I'm gonna let that go now, like they're letting part of their identity go, and that is hard. That's a tough place for people to be, even though you desperately want what's ahead of you, letting go of that part of identity is a big change. And it sometimes just chunking it down into those smaller steps that feel, and I think as you bring in the new bits of you that you're like, oh, I really enjoy being someone who works out 3 times a week. I really enjoy someone who goes to bed at a decent time and wakes up at a decent time. I really enjoy being someone who is more organized with my time and all of the rest of it. Then you naturally start to let those old parts of you leave them behind. But it's that forward focus, isn't it? And it's tough. It is tough. And nobody says change is easy, but when it's locked in with your values and your purpose and the things that are important to you, it makes change worth it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this all links in nicely to the third question, so I'll go with it now. And thinking about encountering resistance to change in a client, someone you're working with, what approach do you take when you encounter resistance to change in someone?
As in they are resisting change, or that there is a resistance that they don't feel in control of?
So I'm thinking about, so I guess in the context of my work, I'm thinking about someone's so resistance from them. So perhaps they've identified that they want to make changes to their health, fitness, behavior. But when working through what those changes might be, what they could be, there's a resistance from them to do that, even though they've perhaps identified this as something that's quite important to them and something they want to do. There's a resistance there to what behaviors or what actual tangible changes might need to be made to. Does that make sense?
Great question. I think that's the challenge, isn't it? So I think there's 2 things that come to mind with that. And the first one is that if they are resistant to changes, who's coming up with the change? And I think sometimes that's the challenge, isn't it, of that coaching relationship of offering some suggestions or offering a framework or a model or something that that could work for them. If they're resistant to that, then I think my question would then be, okay, that doesn't feel like it's a reasonable solution from their perspective. So making sure it comes back to them to say, okay, what is it that you want? What do you feel is possible? Let's talk through that, rather than me coming up with suggestions that have worked for other people. And I try to really avoid that with coaching, because the more it comes from the individual, the less likely they are to be resistant to that. They might have some reservations, they might have some nervousness about it, but the more it comes from them, the less that becomes an issue. And the other thing that came to my mind is that if there is a resistance to it, of helping them to understand what that resistance is. And I think, like I said, I had a first session with someone today, and one of the questions that I asked was, how much challenge do you welcome in the sessions? Because some people are really comfortable with that pushback, with that challenge, and other people not so much. So it's something that as you build rapport and you get to know the person that you're working with, you get a feel for what level of challenge works and when to push and when to back off. But I always ask that question up front as well, because some people are like, I need you, I've been stuck in this mindset for a long time. I need you to really challenge. I need you to disrupt the way that I think. And I'm like, okay, I can do that as long as I have your permission to do that. And other people are like, I'm going to need you to kind of go gently on this one. So I think sometimes it's just helping them and calling it out sometimes, like, I sense some resistance there. What is it that worries you about this? And just exploring it with them. And I think that's why the term thinking partner in that coaching relationship is a really nice way of explaining it, because I'm not trying to force the answers out of you. What I'm saying is that this is what I'm noticing. This is what I'm observing. you might feel it, even if you don't recognize that that's what's happening. Let's just explore it. Let's just step out of it. Let's walk around it. Let's look at it from different perspectives and see what does feel possible. Because, you know, we talk about comfort zone and the fear zone and that stretch zone as well. And, you know, we don't want to force people into a place that they're not ready to step into. And it's about that encouragement to step into it rather than a push. Saying that they are coming up with the solutions and the suggestions and the alternatives. And if there is a resistance, just helping them explore what that resistance is. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, it does. The
answer, I forget what the question is. It's like a job interview, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it does, and I think that, you know, that resonates hugely with sort of my my approach to that in my work. And I think, you know, primarily that the individual is driving what that change is themselves as much as possible, and that it might be appropriate to offer suggestions at certain points, but that ultimately that as much as possible those changes that are being identified and those behaviors that are being identified are being driven by them as much as possible, and that my role is just guiding them to work out what those are. And I think in motivational interviewing as a sort of a method of communication, they talk about rolling with resistance. And that sort of, you know, avoiding that temptation to, you know, sort of push someone when it's not quite appropriate to do so. Like you say, explore what that resistance is instead. Express empathy towards it, you know, show that it's, you know, it's okay to have that resistance and to have those feelings for a start. But also I think, and I think you spoke about it briefly as well, sometimes I think that exploring that resistance then leads to sort of identifying if there is a discrepancy between the goal that someone has stated that they want and the behaviors that they are not willing to do, but that are right for them to do to get there. So, and I think sometimes, even if someone's identified those changes, identified the goal themselves, identified the changes that they would need to make to get there themselves, that doesn't necessarily mean that the goal and those changes are right for them, because that still might have been influenced by what they think they should do and what they think their goal should be. And that actually that resistance creates a space to say, okay, well, there's some discrepancy here between the goal that was identified by you and the changes that you are happy to make and that feel right for you in line with your values, priorities, etc. And if those two things are never going to align, then, you know, is that the right goal? Do we need to revisit that? Do we need to have another conversation about where things are headed in the longer term? If the path that's needed for that practically is not one that you individually want to take.
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, that's one of the questions, certainly when we're talking about goal setting, you know, actually looking at the goal itself, of looking at the amount of, you know, what's the energy, mental, physical energy you need to put into this to make it happen. And then realistically, how much have you got? Because we know ourselves better than anybody else. Now, I know that there's what I have got, and then what I'm actually going to put into it, you know, and they're not always the same. It's not always the same number, but also, you know, in terms of time, how much time have you got? And sometimes you need to, if you want to dial it back a little bit in terms of effort and energy, then you dial it back and you extend that timeline. But also there's the emotional investment in it as well. And sometimes that's where the conflict is, in terms of, okay, there's lots of emotional investment, but there isn't the energy that matches the emotional investment, and it's just adjusting that. But then, it's such it's a huge topic, isn't it? But I mean, it's in terms of the resistance. Sometimes the resistance is there for a very good reason, and actually sometimes it's a case of time and other things that you can work on, and that resistance, there's a time when they're ready to challenge and change that resistance. But that's not our timeline. That's for them.
Absolutely.
Which is exactly what you said in terms of, that motivational interviewing of like helping them to understand. And sometimes just acknowledging that it's there and calling it out is the first step. And then you park it. You go, that's okay. We can come back to that. When you are ready, we will talk that through and we will explore it. But again, their journey, their pace, right?
Absolutely. Completely agree. And so I guess the next one is probably something we've touched on all the way through, really. But I guess I'm thinking of in terms of if someone's feeling a bit stuck, know that something needs to change in whatever area of life, but hasn't really got a handle on what that might look like or what that is for them. How do you approach, or what do you do in helping someone to identify the change that they want to make?
It's really tough, isn't it? And it does come up. It sounds like, that in that terms of that question, I suspect there's some people that will watch or listen to this and think, well, how do you not know what it is that you want to change? But it comes up a lot. I would say that I can separate the people that I work with into two categories, very generic, but two categories. One group are people who know exactly what it is that they want. They just haven't been able to make it work and make it happen on their own. And then there's a second group who they don't know what they want. They just know it isn't what they've got at the moment. And so they're almost a step further back of helping them to understand what that is. There's lots of different tools that I use. It very much depends on the individual. I don't tend to use the Wheel of Life exercise as with everybody, but I have used it with people because it's such a great visual in terms of looking at different areas of life and what works, what doesn't work, what is going well, what isn't going well. I've adapted that in terms of balance, of trying to help people to understand maybe what's out of balance. Sometimes we look at values. We'll look at identifying what their values are and what values are in alignment, but more importantly, what values are not in alignment with life as it is at the moment. I've also looked at needs. So, human psychological needs. How are your needs being? So first of all, what are they? How are you meeting these needs at the moment? Because sometimes that will help people to understand, oh, well, I have a need for this and that is not being met anywhere at all at the moment. And then that helps to start a conversation. There's lots and lots of different ways. There's some great frameworks out there to be able to use. It very much depends on the individual. And sometimes it's what you pick up on in those first conversations, and either something that they say or maybe something that they don't say, but as they're talking about something, you just notice that change in their body language and you think, oh, okay, that's interesting. Tell me what that was. So I think sometimes it is just really tuning in to what people are saying, how people are saying it, and picking up on perhaps when they talk about something that they don't look as comfortable, or certain things come up in different ways in different conversations that might offer a suggestion. And sometimes it's just a case of peeling back the layers, and sometimes it's one thing and you get 2 or 3 sessions in and you're like, oh, and then they say, oh, that's what it was, and you're like, that's okay, because it's that, sometimes it takes a couple of sessions and a few conversations to peel back those layers to find out what is going on under the surface. So
absolutely. So I think the very first thing you said there, I think is definitely the case, that there could be a lot of people thinking, well, surely if someone's coming to work with you, whether it be in a coaching setting, sports psychology setting, whatever it is, then there's something they want to change, they know they want to do. But I think I find, and I think the way you said that there's 2 different groups of people that you might work with, I think is the same in my work, in that some people will be seeking help just because they know that they're not in the place they want to be right now, whether that's to do with whether it's a non-athlete in terms of health, fitness, in terms of where they're at, or whether it's an athlete who's just not enjoying their sport anymore, or, you know, someone who engages in competitive sport and has enjoyed it. That's why they've always done it, but they're not enjoying it now. And actually the work is in unpicking what's not working for you right now, before it's about moving to, okay, well, what would positive change look like for you? But actually, if we don't understand what's not working now, then how can we base any movement towards anything on, on a solid foundation, if we don't understand what that foundation is of, these are the reasons why this isn't working for me. And so I think, taking those deep dives into that, taking the time to, and I think as a practitioner, it can feel counterintuitive sometimes, because you want someone to feel like they're making progress, and by sitting too much in the present or in the past can sometimes feel counterintuitive to that. But I think I strongly believe that understanding that foundation is really key to then any movement in the future being something that's going to be worthwhile and worth doing.
And it's that meaningful, purposeful as well, isn't it? Because we can all make change for the sake of making change. Absolutely. And I think that sometimes is the challenge, is people make changes on the surface and they think, oh, well, I'll just change this, nice quick win. I'll just change this and then everything will start to feel better. And then things don't feel better. And it's like, right, okay, well, I'll try this. And then they try something else, and then they try something else. And it's like, on the surface, it feels like they're doing all of the right things to make them feel better, or to give them the results that they're looking for, or to achieve the success that they're looking for, but it's not working, and there's a disconnect there somewhere. And sometimes the disconnect, I have spoken to a lot of people who tell me, on paper life is good, so why don't I feel like it? That comes a lot. On paper, everything that should make me happy, and I don't feel happy, so what's going on? And that's always an interesting one, because obviously with coaching, we're not therapists. We need to make sure that we understand where that line is, and whether or not that's something, especially when people are describing certain feelings that have been that way for a sustained period of time, we need to make sure that that boundary is in place, of making sure they get the right professional support. But sometimes it's alignment of values and needs not being met, which it's not something we learn in schools. So it's not necessarily something that people would think about as, okay, this is why I don't feel the way I would expect to feel in this situation. So it's an interesting. I don't work with a particular demographic, and I don't work with a particular challenge. So I perhaps see this more than some coaches would, because they work with a particular challenge. So people have identified this is the challenge they want support with and go to that coach, whereas I don't. But I love the variety of that. I love that, being able to work with that person and help them to solve what is the problem and find what is their solution.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that on paper, I think that's a really key one, because I think that that a lot of people would put themselves in that bracket, I think, and I think that can sort of contribute to people's reluctance to seek support with that, because actually, I think there's all that part of us that don't want to, go into something and look silly for doing it, because when we get there, we don't actually know what it is we're there for. I think you always expect the first question, and the first question usually is, well, why have you come to me? What are you, why are you here? And if someone's like, well, I don't really know, I think it's really important to emphasize really that space is there to explore that. And I think one of the biggest difficulties for sports psychology as a discipline, particularly in elite sports settings with in high level, is the perception that you only go to a sports psychologist if you have a problem. but actually, rather than see it as something, as more of a sort of, it could be that there's something in particular that needs working through, but it could also be that actually this is just an exploratory space for me to see what I could do or what I could work on to achieve whatever it is that somebody's looking to achieve. And so I think that's really important.
People quite often say, don't they? Well, I feel it's very unfair because I'm expecting you to know how to help me with something when I can't tell you what the problem is. And it's, or maybe there isn't a problem. Maybe this is just we explore how you feel. We talk about, we give you that space to talk it through. And sometimes people come to that solution on their own, just having that space to talk it through. So it's an interesting one. But I think also, just picking up on what you were saying about it only being for the elite, I think that's where there's a slight shift, or there has been a shift over the last couple of years, because I think people recognise that with coaching, whether it's sports coaching, career coaching, confidence coaching, menopause, health, nutrition coaching, you don't have to be at rock bottom, and you don't have to be at the very top. There's a huge space in the middle where if you just want things to be better, coaching also works for you too. You don't have to wait, or you don't have to be at rock bottom, and you don't have to be at the top. There's coaching is for everybody. I genuinely believe everybody could benefit from coaching. You just got to find the right coach that works, that fits for you. But I think coaching as in principle, everybody could benefit from coaching.
Absolutely. I agree. And I'm going to come on to my last question, which is probably a slightly different direction, but how do you approach working with someone who has experienced unexpected change? So I guess we've spoken about when people are perhaps coming and looking to make change or trying to figure out what that change might be. But, something's happened. There's an unexpected change in their life. How do you approach working with someone who's managing that, dealing with that?
I do. And I would say sometimes it's not hugely different. I think one thing that does come up with unexpected change, I will quite often share with them the Kubler-Ross change model. Sometimes I show other change models as well. But I think when change happens to us rather than us initiating change, it's a very different feeling. And it's quite often a different process, although it's a similar process that we work through, but it feels very different because we feel like it's happening to us. So I think the Kubler-Ross change curve comes up a lot in those scenarios, just helping people to firstly understand that this is very normal. However you feel on that curve is very, very normal. And especially with change that happens to us, quite often there's a different feel in terms of almost like a grieving process of what we've lost or what we perceive to have lost. And quite often there's a lot of uncertainty around change that happens to us. And that's uncomfortable because we don't know, and there's lots of unknowns. So I think with that, quite often talk about what's in your control, what can you influence, but also helping them to work on, and this is where it's not dissimilar, work on what do they want the new normal to look like in terms of acceptance of the change that has happened. What do they want their new normal to look like? What are they able to keep? What do they want to keep? And what, is there an opportunity to perhaps let go of something that hasn't been working for them as they go through this change process? So some of it is the same, like the circle of change, circle of control, circle of influence, that comes up even with instigated change. What do you want your new normal to look like? And that's the same. I think it's more just helping them to manage the emotions and managing their response to the change, helping them to identify where they are in control of it, rather than where it's happened to them. I think the emotional element is quite often the kind of most significant difference, I think. But it's difficult, isn't it? Because change happens to us a lot, and we don't always recognize it. We just move with it and we make it work, and we make it happen. But when it's a significant change, that can be really, really difficult to work with. And so just helping people to understand that, you know, there's a model, there's like huge amounts of research out there that tells you that this is absolutely okay to feel this, you know, and to all of the emotions that you're experiencing and that you're ping-ponging and bouncing around in with is all very, very normal, and it's okay, and the emotions will pass. Some of them will return, and then they'll pass, and you'll move on to, you know, different feelings. And I think the other thing with change that happens to us is all of the firsts, you know, the first experiences since that change, and helping to manage through those as well, because quite often people feel like they've moved on, and then there's a first of something, and it pushes them, or they feel it pulls them back. But I think sometimes it's just recognizing when you're not in control as well, and accepting this bit is not in my control, and I just need to go through one day, 1 hour at a time, and then this will pass, and I'll get through today, and then we'll work on tomorrow, you know. And it is that, you know, it really does depend on what the change is, but that's probably the difference. I think the emotions that come with it are probably the biggest difference.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess thinking in the context of sports psychology, you know, some of the big unexpected changes that might happen are, you know, a career change and injury, for example, retirement. You know, in sports psychology, we talk about retirement as such a big key transition phase, and sometimes people know that retirement is coming, or they're beginning to prepare for it. Sometimes it happens unexpectedly because of injury or deselection, perhaps, and you know, that process it comes earlier. And I think, you know, hearing you talk about sort of that grieving process, and then the other side of it, of sort of the new normal. What does the new normal look like for me? You know, I think what I did, I was working on a research project a couple of years ago that was looking at the body image experiences of retired athletes. So the sort of process that people went through. And I think one of the big things that came out of it was that, you know, those who had time to sort of prepare for their retirement beforehand were much further down that line in terms of the moving from the grieving to working out what that new normal looked like, and being in a space where they felt ready and able to fully explore that. And, you know, you know, it can cut. I know it's not sort of just shifting from one to the other, but it goes back and forth a lot. But that those who were able to prepare for it and had help in preparing for it were at the point of retirement were much more in a space of, right, well, now I'm going to explore what this looks like for me. Whereas those who were like, okay, I got injured and now it stopped and now I'm here, that there was still all of that grieving to go through. And although, as I say, it's not linear and you're going back and forth between those two stages, that was a really interesting, important finding for me in terms of, you know, how people in that particular example of change in retirement, you know, the preparation or lack of preparation that there might be for people in that. And when it does just happen, what is the, you know, what's the fallout from that, and what's the journey that someone goes on after that? And I think, you know, in that grieving and, you know, there needs to be space for that as well, doesn't there? I think, you know, that's the thing. If it's, I think for me, it's also about knowing when someone's exploring with someone, when they're ready to start thinking about other things. I think we've all had those cases where something's happened and someone's gone, oh, but you can still do this and you can still do that. And it's like, hang on a minute. that's not what I want to do, because I wanted to do that thing and it's been taken away from me. And that acknowledging that, just after it's happened, that grieving process is to that loss of whatever that thing is really a really important part of that process.
Yeah. And I would love to see that research, actually. If you let me have a link to it, I would love to have a look at that. But I think the other thing that I notice, and this, whether this is with sports people or even in terms of retirement in general, it's really important to understand what needs our work have met. Because when we come out of that working environment, whether that's as an athlete or just the more sort of generic working world, we have to meet those needs in a different way. So we have to find an alternative for them, and an alternative healthy way to meet those needs. And I think for certainly my experience of not my own journey, but being in a world with a son who is now a professional athlete, and being in an environment with other professional athletes, I think that sporting world meets very generic needs, but in quite a specific way. And so it's really important, I think, my son's 21, but we have those conversations around what that means to him, because when he's not in that environment in years to come, hopefully a long time ahead, he will need to meet those needs in a different way. And so understanding what is it about what he does, what is it that's important, and what are the alternatives outside of that sporting arena to be able to meet those needs. And I think there's other complexities around the athlete in terms of, and I think slightly going off topic a little bit, but in terms of I certainly saw during COVID, when sport was played behind closed doors, some of the athletes' needs were not being met without the crowd, without the support, without that part of their game. And I think that in itself was a bit mind-blowing for a lot of people, because they couldn't understand, even athletes themselves were like, but we're still playing, the game hasn't changed, this isn't different. But it is different. And so it's understanding what those needs are, because when you come out of that, you need to understand and find alternatives. And it's the same, for people that are retiring, you have to find replacements to fulfill those needs, because ultimately as humans, that's really important to us. And you can't just go, oh, well, I'm going to stop now, because that will have a time limit. And eventually you will need to fulfill those needs. And if you don't proactively find ways to do that in a healthy and positive way, you will find ways to fulfill them in a way that might not be healthy or positive.
Yeah, absolutely. And that COVID point that you mentioned there really resonates with some of the stuff from that research as well, because I think there was, a tendency for some people in retirement to physically do the same things in terms of training, nutrition, as they were as an athlete. Okay, well, I can train on my own. I'm just going to continue the same routine. And I would hazard, a guess that some of that was about trying to meet the same needs that were being met as an athlete. But actually, the competition, the support system, the social support around all of that wasn't there. The behaviors were the same, but all of that other stuff wasn't there. So there's, I think for some would have still been some needs not being met. So that resonated when you spoke about COVID.
Fascinating, isn't it? I know, I would love to have known what I know now 10 years ago, when we first met. Oh my God, if we know, you were a bit further ahead in terms of your study, and your knowledge was way ahead of mine. But I just think what I would do differently if I knew then what I know now. For me, it's just watching things with curiosity of, okay, that's interesting, what's going on there? And then not offering unsolicited coaching advice and support. Just hold on to that, Zoe. That does not need to be shared. Just sit with it. But yeah, it's fascinating. Oh, we could talk for hours, couldn't we?
Yeah.
Oh, great questions. And I've really enjoyed the conversations. Like I said, we booked this in a long time ago, so I was looking forward to it, but it's been a really interesting conversation, and thank you so much for your insights as well.
And thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed it. Yeah, it's
been great. I apologise for the dog background noises, which hopefully by the time this goes up onto the podcast channels will have been seamlessly edited out. But I think there might be a few dog noises in the background. But life is life, right? Thank you ever so much. It's been great to have you on as a guest. Thank you for those who are watching and listening back. Feel free to get in touch with Han. Their contact details will be all linked into this. We're going to link in their pages, their website, so that you can get hold of them. And if you've got any questions, post them in the comments. I'll keep my eye on them. And if I can't answer them, or if I think Han is better placed to answer them, I will make sure they get it so that they can come back to you. But thank you so much. Great conversation. And we will be back next month with a new topic, new guest, and 5 new questions.